Everyone, welcome. I am really delighted to be introducing Gentle Radicals this morning for a conversation about decolonising faith. Here they are. Gentle Radical are an arts collective based in Cardiff, and this morning is going to be an invitation to think about decolonising faith. It's going to be an informal conversation between the four of them here, and they'll say a bit more about that. Gentle Radicals' work explores the spiritual, political, cultural dimensions of the kind of things they focus on. And I first encountered their work during lockdown, where I went to an online event, Anthologies of Care, that was just the whole process, the whole way the event was done, as well as like this very varied content, felt like it was really rooted in kind of radical notions of care that I found really inspiring. So yeah, I just feel really delighted to be introducing you all, and I'll hand over now.
Thank you so much. Hi everyone, thanks for having us. It's really good to see you all. Don't want to start by being oppressive in any way, but if anyone wants to come closer, you just feel like so far away. If you do, and if not, it's all cool. But we are going to say, I'm going to say very little before we kick off with something. And as per the introduction, I suppose what we're really interested in at Gentle Radical is placing art and culture in the service of justice in the 21st century. And I suppose not art as a tool for change, but in service to justice. And we also don't believe we can have justice without spiritual justice and spiritual revolution. So these things are really deeply interconnected for us. And then, the word decolonising and the word faith are each of them deep, weighted, heavy, words, and especially words like, both of those words are very. They kind of come with problematics and challenges, and particularly decolonising in terms of its overuse. And I suppose the thing we wanted to say before we started is we are not experts here, we're students, we're learning. I'm sure you may have a lot more to say about these things than possibly we do, but we're just on a journey. And we're just going to introduce ourselves by name and pronouns, and then I'm going to pass on to Samson and explain what he'll be doing. But I'm Rabab, I go by she, her.
I'm Stephen, he, him.
Tony, he, him.
Samson, he, him.
And what we thought we'd do is just begin with a little sharing of something that we developed last year for an exhibition. And it was an exhibition of, amongst other things, a series of video works. And in the end, what we produced for this, 2-hour video kind of work, one aspect of it was a series of letters that people within our collective wrote to each other. They didn't just write these letters off the cuff. It took quite a while for us to drill down into all the topics that we felt were close to our hearts. So we conducted a series of conversations over a number of months. We edited these, and part of the video was letters from one member of the collective read to camera in somewhere located within our neighbourhood of Riverside, which is where we locate ourselves. So we thought this would give a flavour of some of the things we're thinking about through a cultural context, political context, spiritual context. So I'm going to hand over to Samson, who's just going to share an extract from this piece.
Yeah, and my letter was to Stephen, who's here, and we all shared a different letter to a different person in the collective, many of whom aren't here. I'm just going to dive in. I then ask you a question. I ask you a question about God. Because we've talked about this before, we've unfolded it between us. You say, yes, good, you want to have another run at God, because you don't think you were so articulate about it last time we spoke. You say that once you start talking about God, it inevitably leads you to queerness. And how it's funny, whilst we talk of temples and displacement from buildings, you mention that actually you haven't been in a sacred building or worship space for over 18 months now with this pandemic, and yet you still feel committed to practice. And you say, this makes sense, because you have this feeling that God isn't contained in buildings, but somehow in all of our structures and in the structure of our thoughts. Smallness. You then speak of smallness, the smallness of God, and how for you that's interesting because in many ways God isn't small. God is bigger than languages, you say, but that we have this strange language we live with around the totality of God, an almighty God, and how completely alienating you find this. Instead, you want to talk about the smallness, how God manifests in intimacy, in tininess, in the not so grand things or obvious places, in the atoms of the everyday. You come back to queerness, saying that for you, the practice of living from this divine, true self, as opposed to a kind of false self, gets you to queerness. Because queerness, you say, is all about operating out of a true self, not a constructed self. That to be queer is to come to a place of truthfulness, your own self-actualization as a beloved being, that the very truth of what and who one is beloved. You ask what God is for me, and I tell you that I'm not entirely sure. Sometimes I don't know. That so often it's a feeling, and that the God I pray to has many, many faces, and they're mountains or they're rocks or trees or hillsides or dawns. I talk about the Shekinah, this feminine form of God that I feel in my body, that I feel her arrive on Shabbat. And I remind you that I write poems, and that I've written poems about, I don't know, I suppose moments of meeting God, in a mushroom even. You know, I'm out foraging and then I find this mushroom and it tells me something about where I am and who I am in relationship to this land that I'm in. And so maybe God is this kind of mushroom speaking to me about home. At the end of our conversation, we talk about how people need to experience the medicine of feminizing or queering liturgy and prayer. And you say you're excited that we could be a small part of making that happen in Wales. And then you pause and you ask, I wonder how we begin to do that. I wonder how we begin. Right, that's that.
Thank you. So what we thought we'd do, actually we chose that, we could have chosen a lot of extracts, we chose that because we feel it touches on so much in terms of what we understand by the myriad manifestations and practices of the decolonial. And what we were going to do in this time we have together today is we thought we'd each maybe take 4 or 5 minutes just to kind of try and speak to what that means for us, or what is resonating when we think of decoloniality in relation to faith and spiritual practice. So we're going to do that first, each of us. And then when we were preparing, we thought actually maybe we can have a set of, like a list of principles that we feel are connected to faith and decoloniality as well. And so we're going to try and riff on those a little bit. It's going to be very conversational. And then we wanted to just keep 15-20 minutes at the end. More if it's needed, we can maybe kind of shorten things at our end and open out, like, could be for questions, but commentary and you know, sharing your perspectives. We'd love to hear that as well, and thoughts and responses. How does that sound? Is that a plan? Okay, so I think, I don't know about anyone else, I find it really challenging to talk in 5 minutes, so I'm going to say that in solidarity with my colleagues and comrades, but I think Samson is going to kick us off, just because he started and he may want to continue a little bit on that line around some of the things he shared just then. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it's good. It's good that you're all here and we're having this conversation. Like that's what we feel when we're having a conversation. It's good to be in it. So I'm just going to share a bit of my personal journey with faith, and I guess like where that leads me to now in exploring what it might mean to decolonize faith in my own life in the world. And that's kind of what drew me to originally working with Gentle Radical. So I have Ashkenazi Jewish heritage from what's now Belarus, Poland, Lithuania and Ukraine. And I grew up in Manchester with quite a traditional but relatively secular Jewish family, and festivals and Shabbat and were held, and there was a food culture that was quite strong, and hospitality was a big part of life, but there wasn't really a sense of Jewish spirituality in my daily life. And the spirituality that I did experience through my Orthodox-based synagogue was very kind of rational mind, very detached from the body, very patriarchal in many ways, and very detached from the land, from the earth. And also Zionism was a big part of my Jewish identity growing up. I didn't necessarily connect with it strongly, but it was just there. It was kind of, I went to a Jewish school, we would celebrate. Israel was a massive focus of Jewish identity. And when I was 13, I kind of stepped away from Judaism. I rejected it quite strongly. I remember reading Richard Dawkins and being like, I'm an atheist, I'm done. And I kind of returned to spirituality through a Buddhist practice when I was 18. And I came to Judaism again in a very unexpected way when I was studying at Schumacher College in Devon, and it had been bubbling a bit before that, but I guess I started connecting to the earth, and in a more deep way, and I guess through that deepening I realised that maybe my questions around relationship to God, or that I'd grown up with, like, does God exist, was kind of the wrong question. And maybe that there's this intuitive heart mind which says, I know the earth is sacred, and what is it that you ask of me, and what is it that these traditions can hold for me in caring for and protecting the earth. And then I found through that question that Judaism is rich with answers. So, okay, I'm taking much longer than I expected. I don't know how long I've been. And from then it was kind of like utter faith and calling, kind of a complete leaning back into spirituality. And I sought out, through connection to song in new contexts, and prayer in new contexts that were not patriarchal and maybe not rooted in Zionism and were a bit more connected to the earth. I felt this kind of complete feeling of a relationship with my ancestry that felt true and real, and also I felt this very powerful relationship with God that, and maybe it took me a long time to even use that word again, but now it feels very normal actually. And it was kind of this movement from a rational mind spirituality to something that was more feminine and feminized and more embodied, and also completely politically different. So, as I also grew up, what detached me from my Jewish upbringing and community was my understanding and my growing radical and internationalist and intersectional politics and politics of land justice in a global sense. And that led me to spending time in Palestine. I'd grown up going to Israel my whole life. I have family there. It was just a normal part of my upbringing. I didn't question it until I was 16 or so, and then I learned a lot about what was happening there, and then I wanted to spend some time meeting Palestinians and spending time in the West Bank, so that was a very formative time. And I also kind of met a real kind of land-based culture in Palestine, and a real kind of connection to earth that was sacred and that was deeply embedded. And so I kind of, in this kind of meeting Palestine, meeting the land there in this new way, I kind of realised what it is to be in deep relationship with the earth, and what it is to be deeply oppressed in that relationship as well, and prevented from your the potentiality of that, and so that was a big formative moment. And I guess I also went to Adamah, which is this Jewish diasporist farm in Connecticut, and in the US, and where they're kind of precisely asking, well, if not assimilation, if you really want to hold on to your Judaism and its specific cultural identity, but also if not Zionism, then what is our culture, our expression? And if you really want to care for the earth, then what does it look like? So finding ways to embed Jewish culture and identity in place without the oppression of another people and in complete harmony with other peoples, and finding ways to liberate ourselves and trusting in the possibilities of what liberation rooted in the land might look like. And I guess I believe that connection to the earth and connection to the land is kind of essential for a lot of healing to happen for all peoples, for Jewish peoples included. And so a lot of the root of Jewish oppression is around landlessness and exile. And so how do we heal that? It's become a big question in my life. I'm almost gonna... Am I still... Have I gone over quite a lot? Anyway, I'm going to come to... and then in the last 5 years, all these learnings have been... I would feel deeply connected to this land here, this island that I found myself in, and feel, committed to building this work here. And so kind of holding these things together, a radical politics and internationalist politics, a diasporism, which means to me rooting where you are, being where you are, and being committed to that land in a way that is... you're saying this is my home, and and asking what that means, what my responsibility is, and then I guess I identify now as like an earth-based Jewish diasporist, where I believe in the possibility of liberation through relationship with land and diaspora, and I want to do that here in this land where I am, and so I'm gonna end it there. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'll go next. I'm Stephen again. I'm coming from a Christian faith background. I grew up a Christian. I'm still a Christian, but a different sort of a Christian, maybe than I was as I started out. In the Church of England, in a very ritualistic end of the Church of England, which I loved and still love in many ways. Much of that beauty and some of the silence and the music, where there was a spiritual connection for me. But I grew up struggling with some of the beliefs that I was invited to believe in that context, in some of the exclusivism of a sense of only one path. Not that it was sort of strongly, bashed into us, but a sense of that. Growing up in the West Midlands in a very diverse area, I was kind of trying to square that circle of what made sense of the words we use, what do they actually mean in the context of being aware of the diversity of religion. As well as coming to terms as I grew up with my sexuality as a bisexual man, and feeling the homophobia of the church, again not bashed into or talked about a lot, but silently. It didn't feel like an affirming space. So I sort of similarly went through times of searching, and maybe many of us have gone through times of searching in our spiritual journeys. But at the same time, I didn't entirely lose a sense of the spirit. And when I was still an adolescent, still a teenager, I kind of had a particular spiritual experience where I was in a very particular moment healed and kind of liberated of my internalized homophobia and biphobia, and it was that was like the beginning of my coming out process. was spiritual, was deeply spiritual, and it was like God outed me is what I've always said. And God outed me, and God started that process. And so that, in a sense, my whole life has been an unfolding of that, a kind of a deep experience of faith being liberating, faith liberating me of some of the things that were oppressing me in terms of internalized shame, and then continuing to search for that journey of how can faith practice be liberating. I explored a few different kind of spiritual paths in my life. Quakers, a little bit Sufis. I ended up joining the Unitarian Church as a community rooted in Christianity, but also open in many ways it operates. And for me, the important thing of having a sense in that of the divinity of Jesus being something that is inherent within all of us, that divinity is our birthright as human beings, not just for a particular person. I went and studied in the United States for a couple of years in Boston and was more exposed there to kind of feminist thought, some of the kind of traditions of African American spirituality, where I studied at Boston University is where Martin Luther King did some of his work, and so there was a real sense of that prophetic sense of the work of faith community, which I kind of absorbed. Came out to the UK and began training as a minister in the Unitarian Church. I became a minister, served in Bolton for a number of years very happily with a very friendly but fairly traditional kind of setup. And then a few years ago moved down to Cardiff, where I am now, with a role that was more open in exploring what was happening in the community, in the streets, in the city, and with a sense of what is going on that I can connect with. And what I found was Gentle Radical and Rabab and everyone else here had a sense of dialogue, and today is a kind of continued dialogue, the dialogue we just got to keep having from our different places, but committed to this: what would it mean for faith to be liberating, and what difference can it make to liberate us from not just our own kind of struggles, but also kind of the structural economic struggles of our society, of racism, of inequality and poverty. And in the context of the climate crisis, how can faith, how can some aspect of spirituality be of service in this moment of growing crisis, of a crisis that is rooted deeply in many other crises of the world, of generations of kind of colonialism and capitalism, but coming to a kind of where we are now in this moment in history, like how can we be of service to that? What role might faith or spirituality have being in service to that? Which is a question that, it's always good to end with questions that you're not sure you can answer yourself. But I will finish there.
Okay, I think I have quite a different trajectory and journey, because I think mine is rooted in a sense of being disconnected from lineage. So I grew up as a child, maybe on and off until I was 10, in Mosul in Iraq, north of Iraq, and obviously a majority Muslim country, but I grew up in a Chaldean Christian family, sort of Chaldean Catholic Christian family, but not a particularly not strongly practicing necessarily, but I think I must have had a very strong sense of spiritual calling, although I didn't have the language for that when I was a child. So I developed a very personal relationship with what I suppose thought was God, I didn't quite know what that was, but and that fell away as I got older into my teens. But I think there was a huge drive to find belonging and a spiritual grounding. And I think because of the nature of Iraq's trajectory, and for all kinds of complex reasons, not returning, obviously not least the fact that, there have been successive cultures of industrial levels of violence, visited upon that country amongst many others. I think my journey in kind of faith and spirituality has been to try and seek out a kind of sense of belonging and home, and I don't think that's unique. I think many of us in different ways are trying to do that and find where home is, find where belonging is. And I suppose within a diasporic context, my own lineage is quite mixed, so Iraqi, Armenian, on my mother's side also American, and so I didn't have a natural faith home. I couldn't turn up at the mosque, and actually a lot of the Chaldean Christians communities, particularly in diaspora, are sort of quite conservative, quite traditional, so I just did not find spaces where I felt at home, so I carried on kind of searching really, and then really met Buddhism when I was 24, and I've sort of been practicing within a Buddhist tradition called Nichiren Daishonin Buddhism. So it's kind of essentially the teachings of a 13th century priest. And I can say a lot more about that. And I suppose practicing. So that's like 27, 28 years of practice within a particular spiritual community. And I am not easy. I don't sit easily within institutional or organisational spaces at all. So that journey has also had its really interesting kind of tensions for me. And I'd say that mirrors a lot of the tensions generally I experience in any kind of organisational frame. At the same time, I believe in organisational frames because I don't believe we can practice alone. So like one of those questions for me is, what does it mean to work within community, within organisational spaces, but that spaces that are decolonising themselves and constantly reflecting on how they displace themselves from power and hierarchies. Like I think that's a huge amount of work that we have to do, and that we have to do within ourselves as well. And so for me, when we talk about decolonising, it's like, how do systems of thought, systems of faith, systems of what are the processes of questioning and disrupting power, really? How do I disrupt power in myself? Like how do I dismantle my attachment to forms of power in myself? How do I dismantle the colonial within myself? Or the patriarchal, the conditioned, patriarchal within myself? And I'm gonna, there's a couple of things to finish really. I suppose one of the ways in which I read text and I suppose the spiritual teachings of the tradition I've not grown up in but have adopted and embraced is when I started reading the writings of this 13th century priest, the things that drew me to those writings were the articulation of the position of women. Like I found feminism in those texts, and I found an ecological perspective in those texts, which of course is deeply grounded in Buddhism. I also found a reading of authority and class and social status in those texts, and that felt essential for me. And of course that is 700 years old, and there are aspects of any teachings that are 700 or 1,000 or 3,000, there's aspects of those things that sit within the contemporary context still beautifully and resonate, and there's other aspects that need to be updated, and I think that is part of our spiritual faith traditions, and it's about holding lightly as well as holding rigorously. How do we do those two things together? But I suppose to end, I just wanted to maybe share, like I remember, share a piece that just in an early part of my practice really struck me, and I can't quote it, but in one of Nichiren Daishonin's writings are all in the form of letters to people, and I really loved that. I imagine myself, what would it be? And they were to his followers, actually, to his disciples, and so there's something very intimate about that, about letter writing. Maybe I have a thing about letter writing. We made a project which is about our letters of address to each other, right? But there were hundreds of these letters, but I remember one of them where he was explaining this concept of the true Buddha and the provisional Buddha, and it was really interesting to me in the way that was framed. And essentially, to Tracy, he was saying, our perception is that the true Buddha is the historical Buddha, right? It's Shakyamuni. That is the true Buddha. That is the highest, I suppose. There's a place of whatever that authority we accord, a spiritual founder, and the provisional Buddha are the people, and that was flipped completely on its head. And what he said is actually the true Buddha is ordinary people. Shakyamuni is the provisional Buddha. The existence, his function, the function of his existence is to let us know we are the true Buddha. Ordinary people are the true Buddha. And I think what I understand by decolonising faith is that we place the dignity of life and of ordinary people at the very heart of our practice, which means dismantling the power structures that continue to oppress us. And we extend those power structures, consciously or not, within our own spiritual traditions, and there is work and labour to do within that. I suppose finally, Gentle Radical is a space where we try and dismantle ideas of what that labour is. So we understand that we work, so there is our wage labour, there is our cultural labour, there is our spiritual labour that we do with each other. That's not always easy. You know, there are tensions between us, right? Like anyone else. We have to do the work of conflict and difficulty. Our caretaking labour, our parenting labour, our interpersonal labour. Part of decolonial practice for us is what it means to understand that all of that labour overlaps, crosses over. And it is colonialism, capitalism, systems of oppression that have separated out practices of labour. But actually being in service is to bring all of those things, to try and bring all of those things together and return to ancestral ways of living and being together.
And then she says, follow that. Gosh, my journey to religion, I felt like I was born into religion. My consciousness was born into a religious family. Not just in the context of going to church on a Sunday, on a Friday evening, but also in terms of having depictions of a white Jesus on the wall. My parents sitting with a prayer book, singing songs at home, and listening to Sunday services. And it really informed our family development. And it so happened we were the one African Caribbean in about 5 streets, and it wasn't a very diverse area. So it felt very particular. Not in the sense that, I have to say, in terms of the challenges we met as a diverse family in the area, wasn't linked to our religion. So even though I went to an Afro-Caribbean, or predominantly I should say Afro-Caribbean church, that was, for a number of years, it was a place of solace, a place of peace. But in terms of myself and my younger sister, interestingly enough, growing consciousness, we became aware of the fact that there was an oppressive consciousness within that space. I think part of the colonial connection to our religious practice was that we'd ingested our place in the world. We were taught to accept what we had, and we will find heaven at the end of our earth life. And that engendered a sense of lack of capability. There wasn't a sense that we could change the world, or we shouldn't even seek to change the world as it was in our lives at the time. There was an acceptance of the colonial master, psychologically. And we maintained certain elements of the culture of looking at things very moralistically. There wasn't an embodiment of the religion, the spirituality within Christianity. It's very much a focus on the good and the bad, the right and the wrong, the righteous and the spiritual, heaven and hell. And there wasn't much room for people to have their lives considered. And as we grew older, we got a sense of the reality of human existence, which wasn't being addressed. We knew there were people there, for example, who had challenges in lives around alcohol dependency, domestic violence, challenges raising your family, challenges with finance, and none of that was ever addressed. We put on our best clothes every Sunday, we put on our best face, our best friends every Sunday, and none of that was discussed. So I left the church at a run, I have to say, in my late teens, and for a period of time, I wouldn't say that I became I never really gave up on the idea of religious practice or spiritual practice, but I became very agnostic, and I think I found my home in politics. Fortunately, I found Martin Luther King, found Stevie Wonder. Actually, I found Stevie Wonder first. Stevie Wonder, reading his biography as a late teen, led me to Martin Luther King, to Angela Davis, to Malcolm X, and a real spiritual consciousness in terms of the role of religion as a way of empowerment. Re-envisioning, because obviously it's very much focused on African Americans and people who I felt were closer to me at that time than the white people living around me, really started to engender with me the importance of spirituality, but without becoming religious at that point in my life. And I have to say, my awakening came for this young lady here. We did a training course, how many years ago? 20 plus years ago. And that time I didn't even know Rabab was a Buddhist. But it was a very diverse group actually. It was spiritual, religious diversity, ethnic diversity. We came from different walks of life. And we were all sharing. It became a very intimate group over a period of time. And myself and my then wife kept going home and saying, God, Rabab, she said some really insightful things. We really connected with what she was saying. Because what she was basically talking about was our common humanity. We wouldn't go into that space and say, well, as a Muslim person, and as a Christian person, as a person with no faith, we were all talking about our common humanity. And that really connected with me. And then a few years after, I got introduced to Buddhism and found out Rabab was part of that group. And thought, well, it must have something going for it. But the important thing for me was about the connection to our humanity, the fact we brought all the things of our life into those spaces. We were encouraged to have dialogue. Everything was information that we should explore. The diverse experiences that we had in our lives was all there for us to explore, to unpack, to learn from, to encourage others. There wasn't shame attached to the challenges we may have faced in our lives. There was something we should share and learn from, and we could all learn from. And the sense that we got a sense that other people were struggling was empowering. It wasn't a sense that you have to get to a point, to an end of a journey. It's all part of the journey. And I think that's what really embedded me in this practice. But also the fact that, as Gentle Radical, we've been able to bring that into this space, where it's not a sense of you have to be of a particular ilk in terms of our spiritual religious practice. The fact that we recognise the diversity within that space is what makes us strong. I'd just like to share a quote, really, and it's about the SGI, which is the religious practice we practice, but I think you can bring this to a lot of people on this stage and to other people. The aim of the SGI is not to dominate the world or raise it of other forms of religious belief. Rather, we want to create a society that places the highest possible value on life itself. In doing this, we are forming a network with like-minded people from all faiths and backgrounds to work together to achieve a peaceful world. And I think fundamentally we recognise that to create that peaceful world starts with ourselves. It's not just about forming movements. It's not just about saying we want other people to do things. It's recognising we're all part of that journey in our very diverse ways. So I'd just like to end there.
Thank you. So, we made a list. This is so not an exhaustive list, but we were trying to think, what is it? We had a few chats actually about this, and thought, what kind of things come under, in our minds, the sense of decolonising and faith. And we're going to I'm going to read a few of them out, and then we're going to we're not going to go through them religiously. Excuse the pun.
So to speak.
That was not intended. But we're just going to kind of wend our way. But if there's any of these that you think, actually, can you please talk about that, or I'd like to talk about it, and jump in, please do. So these are some of the things when we are thinking about faith and decoloniality, and decolonising practices really. What comes to mind? So power is right at the centre, structures of power, and who controls narratives and how we tell stories. Dichotomies, binaries of spirit, flesh, earth, male, female, Western mind-based approaches to the world. Institutional spaces, how we really dismantle kind of like how we reinstitute. What is it that we are reinstituting? Stuff around traditional interfaith and kind of, I suppose, sometimes traditional interfaith is a kind of like polite tolerance of each other, as opposed to really getting down into some of the differences and why it's important to go to those places of tension. Kind of spiritual bypass. I don't know how many people are familiar with this term, but that feels very critical and close to a kind of also a conscious awareness, radical awareness of when are we doing the work, when are we not doing the work, and the reasons for that. I think a lot of us can be in spiritual practice whilst not doing the work, right? It can become quite a comfortable place to be. Dominance of particular paradigms within faith spaces, queering faith as a decolonial practice, non-extraction, like if coloniality is about extraction, what is non-extraction and how do we bring this to faith practices? And radical imagination, how does faith speak to the radical imagination? And then also we kind of felt like this idea of radical vulnerability versus certainty, So I'm going to just kick off by reading one of our favourite quotes by Angel Kyoto Williams. People are familiar with like Radical Dharma. Anyway, she's, I don't want to generalise, but like often we think without a doubt, like African American, queer Buddhists are doing some really exceptional work in the world at the moment, and there's no coincidence in terms of like the levels of, the multiple experiences of oppression and how the really clear, dynamic readings of liberation are coming through. So we take a lot of our, certainly some of our leads are from those people, but I want to just read something from Angel Kyoto Williams. We cannot have a healed society, we cannot have change, we cannot have justice if we do not reclaim and repair the human spirit. That's the stuff that bringing down systems of oppression is made of. And so capitalism in its current form couldn't survive, patriarchy couldn't survive, white supremacy couldn't survive, if enough of us set about the work of reclaiming the human spirit. And I suppose the reason we like that quote is our individual liberation is in service to the liberation of the whole, and that must involve the dismantling of the systems that we are living through and under. So, friends, pals, I don't know where we want to begin. I know we've got this list in front of us, but we're gonna freestyle now for a little bit, for maybe half an hour, maybe 25 minutes, and then open up and, But does anyone want to start with the freestyling?
Yeah, we just said we're going to talk about power initially.
Tony.
Not to say we have to stick to the script. But I think that quote's really important because it talks to different sections of the population who have had to really fight to have their place in society, to have a voice, even to be considered. And in doing that, they've really created space for other people to challenge power. I started off with my own reflection in terms of my religious awakening or experience, in terms of the church I was in terms of them really having the colonialized narratives on Christianity and internalize them substantially to the point where they couldn't see them. And that is the work of power, you know, the fact that their lives had been disappeared, essentially. You know, my parents didn't know about their history. I was telling my parents about their history when I got the opportunity to learn and to reflect back. But there wasn't a sense of that they could really make change. People prayed for, sang for change, sang for liberation, but didn't have, we spoke about this earlier, the imagination to imagine, to see how that could happen. And that was part of, for want of a better term, the brainwashing, the acceptance of what the life they'd been born into and they'd experienced. So these movements, you know, the reason why people like Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela, you can name any number of people, are so revered because in terms of challenging the oppressions, they talk about the human condition. They connect it to the human condition, and people can connect to that. They don't have to be a black South African or a Muslim in Myanmar or in South America to recognise the impact it's having on people and families. So I think when people do that, then they actually can see where power potentially impacts on our societies. Yeah. Remember reading about South Africa and I think it was Mandela before he was released, and he was talking about the difference between being imprisoned in your mind and in person, and he was talking about the lives of white South Africans, and he was saying 3 white South Africans are going home behind their locked gates and fences and doors because of the oppression has oppressed them. Yeah. And I think when you can see the impacts of power, when you can actually impact on, to broaden the idea of how power can oppress the powerful, how people can gain liberation, not through the capitalist means, but by recognising the connection they have with others. And then that's true liberation. That's true power.
Yeah, that makes me think of a few things about liberation, because there's different, because we can take liberation as purely spiritual, as kind of the going to heaven thing, and liberation is that, and that is somehow different from the political. And purely individual, it can be the individual. We are, you know, an individual is liberated, and that is separated from the whole. And I think I want to say, when we ask kind of how does our personal liberation relate to the whole liberation, how does it service it? I think you said Rabab, but I think I want to say it is the same thing. Like liberation is one thing, and it might be different for different people. Like the journey of a white person in liberation is not the same as the journey of a black person in liberation, but it is all of a whole journey of which somehow the spiritual stuff, it for me is necessarily part of that, but also cannot be separated from everything else.
Yeah, I wanted to bring Abraham Joshua Heschel because he was a rabbi. He was he was an ally to Martin Luther King, and you know, he marched from Selma to Montgomery, and he said, you know, that march was about protest and prayer, and that legs are not lips and walking is not kneeling, and yet our legs uttered songs. Even without words, our march was worship. I felt my legs were praying. So I guess that what is prayer for is the question, really. Like maybe that we're asking, like, and you know, he also says, which is this quote kind of is a guiding principle of like how I want to engage in prayer. He says, prayer is meaningless unless it is subversive, unless it seeks to overthrow and to ruin the pyramids of callousness, hatred, opportunism and falsehood. The liturgical movement must become a revolutionary movement, seeking to overthrow the forces that continue to destroy the promise, the hope, the vision. You know, I think there's something there around like, if what is faith and spirituality for? Like, really, and what is... And I guess, like, within my own tradition, within Judaism, like, justice is like a central tenet. And I guess in so many forms that's been kind of lost its way, or lost its central piece, or in the idea of justice has lost its imagination. But there are, I guess I'm interested in the work of holding that at the centre of spiritual practice, and
Sorry, can you just say that man's name again?
Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think that reminds me of something I heard early on in my Buddhist practice. Enlightenment for enlightenment's sake is absurd. And I think that speaks to service and justice, and I suppose spiritual bypass comes into that we, the idea that we are working on our own, spiritual liberation, our radical inner revolution, there is a fine line between that and kind of falling into spaces where we are self-serving, and also that path is really interesting, right? Like, I think, so many people do not have the luxury and the privilege of spiritual practice. It's a luxury in many ways, to have the time, to have the energy, to have, and I think, so it is compelling. It is, spiritual practice is compelling in many ways. It can become, I don't know if addictive is the right word, but we can be taken, with our own journey. So I suppose the idea of enlightenment for enlightenment's sake is absurd is about, like, I suppose what that said to me at that time, and it still does, is like I can sit on, I'm going to be cliched here, the side of a mountain somewhere out in nature, connecting with myself and, the interdependence of, the earth of which I am part. But if that isn't placed in service, then there's an absurdity to it. Because I am cutting off from that interdependence by focusing on self, Yeah.
May I speak to Pat for a moment?
Yes, please.
And I want to just mention what for me has been the most inspiring thing politically, globally in the last couple of years. And it reflects back to what you said at the beginning, Rabab. But first I should probably say I was raised an atheist. I became a revolutionary socialist thanks to the Palestinian struggle aged 14 that I'm now connected with. I was gay for many years, and my first wife is Afro-Caribbean. So I connect.
You're talking to all of us.
Years ago. And actually I became a believer through what I now call politico-spiritual work that I was called to do in Zimbabwe, which I won't go into. So I'm loving this. And that was working with both Christians and indigenous medicine men and women in Zimbabwe, where I'm still maintaining strong connections. But I wanted to come back to what you said about how your version of your Buddhist teacher says we are all the Buddhas, because I think, Tony, where globally in that position that you described is that we just don't know what alternative political structures we can imagine that are needed globally, because we're in a global crisis. So it's great, we have to connect to our own land and our own locality where we live, but we also have to have that global picture. Like the Green Party used to say, what was it? Act locally for I don't remember the slogan, it was a good one. But anyway.
Something globally.
Thank you.
Think globally.
But where that political practice of what you said, where all Buddhas comes in, is through citizens' assemblies, because they are made up of just ordinary people selected at random to be representative of the whole community. And the most inspiring thing, I don't know how many people here even know that it happened, but there was a global citizens' assembly created to report to the last COP with 100 people chosen at random from around the whole world. There was an very ordinary Chinese woman, there was a guy from DRC, there was a white woman from Germany. It was just so inspiring, and that to me is the political manifestation of what you described of your spiritual beliefs.
That's really interesting, yeah. I suppose it's, well, I mean, that makes me think of what is it that, like, I suppose, I mean, we may all feel this here, I don't know, but like, also our spirituality is our birthright, you know, in the way that I feel creativity is our birthright. And what these systems, these oppressive systems, these systems of violence over the last 400-500 years and more have done is disconnected us from our birthright. Which is to be truly creative. I mean, like we work in the cultural sector, in the art world, and like there is such a separation of artist and non-artist, professional, non-professional. Now, I'm not saying that I don't have a trade as an artist. I don't want to denigrate my trade. I have a trade, right? I don't have like I've practiced to develop something, you know, to develop my skills as an artist, my curatorial skills. That has a value, you know, like any trade. I want to respect a trade. But actually, that disconnection from, you know, from ancestry means you know, we have lived in different ways. We have lived where our spiritual practices cross over with our community and cultural, ceremonial and ritual celebrations, cross over with our ideas of fairness and justice that are practiced collectively within a community. You know, so I think part of that piece that you're describing is how do we democratize those spaces without clunky versions of contemporary Western liberal kind of democracies, which are broken and are not functioning because they haven't understood the dignity of life. They haven't actually centered the dignity of life. And I'm going to stop in a moment, but it just brings me to a quote, which is one of my absolute favorites, again from my spiritual Buddhist mentor. People are what matter. They are not a means to an end, but an end unto themselves. And the entirety of the colonial project is about using people as means. Using people's bodies as a means, using people's land as a means, their resources as a means, their culture, their history, their ideas as a means. And I think part of, for us, decolonizing spiritual faith and practice is speaking to the processes where we continue to use each other as a means. And I'm using people as a means, right? You know, it's really hard to avoid that. I haven't had a car for about 12 years, and I now have a car. Every time I put petrol in the car, you know, I know I'm using, there's a cost, right? There's a cost to that. I'm eating food, there's a cost to someone. I don't know what to do about it in the immediate sense. But how am I offsetting that? Not in these clunky ways, right? In the way corporations decide they're going to offset. I mean, how am I extracting everything I can from my existence on this planet in the service of creating value, you know, for others? How do I engage in that? And where do I feel my limits? You know, I feel my limits all the time. How do I go beyond my limits? But yes, the overturning as people as means feels very central to the decolonial project for us. Any thoughts? Or from anyone else as well?
Yeah, just reflecting what you were saying there, Rabab. And I think there's something around interdependence. And there's something beautiful about interdependence in terms of sharing roles and responsibilities with our fellow humans. And I think the challenges is that it's become so exploitative. So the idea that we can rely on others for food, for travel, for comfort, is part of the art of living. But I think we're getting increasingly divested of our own connections with other people. You know, and a really simple, really clunky, simple model is you know, if you get your bread baked around the corner, if somebody, you know, the guy around the corner, you know, a woman around the corner fixes your car, there's the local economy, and there's a getting to know people, and it's getting to know people on a first name basis, and there's a real connection, and that has been subverted, where, you know, everything has to be about competing, and also in terms of undermining local economies to generate more money for the already wealthy. or create wealth and then to harvest more wealth. So we're going back to that point you were saying in terms of people in end to themselves. If we're in service of ourselves, in service of our families, if we work, the things we do with compassion, then we have a different economy. If the focal point is compassion, with wisdom, we have to have some courage as well. And then that changes the dynamic. But at the moment, the focal point is economic. And so therefore, not to say that economy is an evil in itself. Finance in itself isn't evil. Even wealth creation in itself isn't evil. But when it's the ends, and everything is driven towards that, then we forget the impact it has on people. The impact it has on families and communities and societies. So it's that bringing things back. And we've lived like this for generations. But in more recent history, since colonial times, it has been around land grabs, extraction, abuse of labour. We have a model. You were saying earlier in terms of we don't have a model in terms of living differently. We do. We have a number of models of doing that, and people around different parts of the world are still doing that. But again, the people in power, going back to the idea of power, we don't share that. That isn't shared. That isn't the models we have to lean into. They're seen as alternative. They're not seen as generative. Because generative makes money, so we are told, regardless of the consequence.
Yeah, but can I come in on that?
Yeah, by all means.
Well, just I guess it feels like it's important to kind of bring up what colonial ways and capitalism has created in order to understand what a decolonial faith practice might look like, and our ideas of relationship with land and ownership have been massively constructed by a colonial framework that has basically created the possibility of private property and ownership of land and has stolen land and turned it into private property for hundreds and hundreds of years all around the world. And some of the work I've been doing, I founded a small collective kind of doing the work around diasporic earth-based Judaism in the UK, and we got really interested in this obscure, forgotten idea that's in the scripture called Shemitah, and the word means release, and it's essentially this kind of manifesto blueprint for a completely different idea of relationship to land, in which you can't own land. Land is a resource that belongs to God, to the great mystery, to the divine, and anyway, it's kind of this Jewish way of imagining a society that can't result in what we have now, which is completely depleted soils and immense concentration of land and wealth in a few hands. And anyway, the idea is that every 7 years all debts are released, and there's a whole kind of reset in the society. So it was just it's interesting that in the text, in the spiritual tradition, maybe faith in itself can be, if kind of understood and practiced in a particular way, can be decolonizing in opposition to the hegemonic power stories that we live with today. I've got lots more to say about Shemitah if you want to chat about it.
Can I just mention that under common law, everybody born is entitled to 4 acres of land at birth to look after, and it should be claimed before they're 7 years old. It still applies now, except I think good luck if you try to apply. I think you need to form a large group of a few thousand people and a few lawyers to get somewhere.
Are there any lawyers here?
That's all I know.
Thanks.
Okay. I think we're going to open this out and just carry on the discussion, maybe between all of us, but you and then the person at the front here. Yeah.
Just a quick question. In what you're suggesting, are you then suggesting that if you live in a home which you own, inverted commas, does that then go back to the government or to someone else every 7 years?
Not exactly.
Oh.
I mean,
Then I must understand then.
Yeah. The idea. I mean, we could spend the whole rest of the time talking, but the idea is that every 7 years all debts are forgiven. So any person. So you can't have accumulation of wealth. It's preventing accumulation of wealth. So you would still own or have stewardship over your land. Basically, and the main thing, which I also forgot to say, is that the land rests. You stop farming the land every 7 years for a whole year. I'm
talking about residential properties, for example.
I don't know. As in, like, it's written in the Torah. It's kind of an ancient concept that was speaking to a particular moment in time. But I guess what's interesting is that if you had followed such a path, the trajectory of, like, if you have checks in place that are coming, this is just coming from one spiritual tradition, to say, like, you can't own land in the way that we understand it now as private property. You can have stewardship over land, you can have rights to land, of course, let's chat about it after, because I'm not, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm kind of putting together about 2 or 3 things that have just gone straight into me. And one is the quote of the only true prayer is subversive. And another is that the steps of the Selma March were prayers. And the other is that the true Buddha resides in every single one of us. And I'm reminded of how when I went on my first XR action and I lay on the floor of Bristol Airport, and it was so deep that I was physically saying, I don't support this expansion. It was like, I mean, I'm putting it together with how so many people in that sort of activist circle kind of speak from a place of incredible authority, and how when the young African-American woman read her brilliant poem at Joe Biden's inauguration when she was about 19, and I remember reading about that, and there's a phrase I forget, but it's this phrase about how we can tap into something deeply spiritual and deeply true. And for me, you're kind of bringing together sort of politics and activism and spirituality in a way that's just really exciting.
Before I know other people want to speak, I just wanted to speak to that actually, because I think that authority, I mean, what we've also put in this list is supremacist cultures. We're trying to dismantle supremacist cultures, right? Male supremacist cultures, white supremacist cultures, heteronormative supremacist cultures. But like within our faith traditions and spiritual spaces, there are supremacist cultures, right? Any faith space, and this goes for kind of all of us, experience this in different ways, which says, which tries to say, look, anything which smacks of this is the way. And we all have that in us, we all have this part of us that wants to say, I found the way, or I need to convince you.
My way.
Yeah, like this has worked for me, and blah, blah, blah. So there's something about dislodging that, displacing that, disrupting that, because at one point am I manifesting that supremacist culture within myself? And I think that for us connects to this idea of radical vulnerability versus certainty. How can I be vulnerable? How can I sit grounded in my chosen faith and my chosen practice, but allow for vulnerability, allow for gentleness, allow for spaces of fluidity within that. It's a really fine line, and I can feel that fine line in myself all the time. I'm trying to navigate it, and I think vulnerability I find is key. Now I talk about, we practice nonviolent communication. We attempt to practice nonviolent communication. I say attempt because it's like the work of a lifetime. So when we have struggles, it's intense. We're trying to practice ways of holding each other in space when we're pissing each other off, That requires a kind of vulnerability that takes me sometimes to the edge, all of us, to the edge of what we think we're capable of, But it feels essential to be authentic in ourselves. Like, I'm not always getting it right. Can I allow my mistakes, my errors, my missteps, you know? I think that's a deeply spiritual thing to do, and we're not in practice. We are not in the space of practicing our missteps, you know, particularly openly, and that was essential. I know someone over here, was it both of you, and then over there, and then over there? Yeah, over there. Either of you, do you want to?
So I think it's really beautiful that the idea of gentle radical and bringing this panel together from multiple different faiths. Something that you've said about the true Buddha brought me back to obviously, you know, the teaching of Christ and you know, to stand with the oppressed and to stand with the poor. You know, that is righteousness in itself, and Christ was a Jew, right? So all of a sudden you've got this whole breakdown of identity just in that alone. So my question is really around what is the danger around the identification with the separate religions that are available to us within our language if we were all born as beings? Because being is a state, right, of emotion, of energy moving, and in spirit, not visible, energy not visible, right? So the anger is not visible, the sadness is invisible, the love is, you know, all of that is coming from spirit. So from a spiritual perspective, as spiritual beings, you know, and something you said about the common law, I mean, you could go look at the Crown Copyright and ask, why is it a unicorn with a chain around its neck? Right? We'll ask that question, yeah? That is true, right? That is a power hold over us. And I believe in the Deuteronomy, I believe is in the Torah, you know, in the first books of the Bible. What does it say in Deuteronomy about taking land and all of these things? But the question really is what is the danger around the identification we hold over our religious identities, and is there power in coming back to ourselves as spiritual beings alone?
Can I just interject and say, thank God someone's mentioned love?
Thank you. I think we all, like, I think everyone's like, but I mean, we're going to, anyone want to begin? Because we all probably have things to say.
I just wanted to say, it's not a total answer to what you're asking, because it's a very deep question.
Yeah.
A lot of levels. But rather than starting off what is the danger, I would maybe say what are the challenges. Yeah?
Thank you.
No problem. It's just the idea that when we go into these spaces, there's going to be challenge, and recognizing that from the offset. You know, it's not the easy way out. You know, it's not the comfortable way. And we've got, I mean, I think it was the often quoted Brené Brown saying about sticking with the trouble. Yes, there's going to be challenges. Stick with it.
Donna.
Learn from it.
Donna.
Sorry. Thank you. So there's enough quotes anyway, just as you Brené Brown, so you can give that. Yeah, so it's recognising that if we want to work in diverse spaces, there's going to be challenges, and we have to be willing to work with that. But a lot of it, and I've said this a number of times already this morning, it's about intention. Yeah, what's our intention? Do we want to thrive within this group? Do we want to develop a different space? Do you want to challenge what's become normative? What is our commitment to that? You know, and I think those are fundamentals really. And are we willing to do that work with? We're willing to learn. Are we willing to do this with compassion? I keep coming back to that word compassion, because I think without that, then it's very easy to become judgmental, or to become didactic, or to want to be the right person in that space. You know, and you've mentioned love. I tend to use the word compassion because I think, and again, it's about how we embrace certain terminology. Even, you know, we are going to grow up in certain spaces, and terminology will mean particular things in particular spaces. So it's around recognising that, and not be. You can be afraid, but you have the courage to go beyond that fear. Yeah.
I think there's something I want to say about the living in the tension of difference and universality. I think there's no easy kind of solution to that, but I don't to underestimate what we have in common is a mistake, but also to say we are all the same is also not recognising nuance and difference and difficulty even potentially. I think we are all the same, and also we're not all the same, and it's living in the truth of both of those statements in an authentic human way, because we're not, we're not just coming together and doing a thing called Interfaith, like we're working together day by day as colleagues. So it's a practice as well in a human way, where we're bringing some spiritual identity into it. And it's the same, it's not the same.
Yeah, I guess there's something about just, I want to imagine like a really deep-rooted interfaith, intra-faith, spiritual community that is saying, I'm committed to learning your histories, your struggles, your stories, to the so committed to them that I can maybe really deeply empathise with them, and then we can imagine futures beyond them together. I think that it's like the commitment to the stories that we come with. And I guess for me personally, there's something very powerful in and healing and liberatory, and for me that I didn't expect from connecting to a tradition that in my own ancestry, and reviving it and renewing it and imagining it. Like it's something around feeling the memory of songs and prayers in my bones. This is me personally, maybe how I would personally answer the question of feeling that, the depth of that in my bones, and feeling the healing possibilities of that. So for me it feels important to connect with that. And I'd also say, like, I've had some of my most profound spiritual experiences and connections, through other people offering prayer and from their own traditions in a particular context that has felt, moved me beyond language or beyond. So I guess I want to hold both, and and like do it be careful with it, and yeah. And
in terms of where I'm sort of leaning into your question, I suppose, do we start again? Do we eradicate what has gone before us to find the right? And I'm not sure we can eradicate. And actually that's what our colonial masters did, right? They just eradicated, they removed. And I think there is an invitation to the tension of being with, I'm going to try and own this myself. I actually want to eradicate a lot, I just want to go, no good, move. I don't want it. It's not, I've already made a decision. That's not working. And like the invitation of my faith is to kind of trouble myself within that space and go, where are the limits of my tolerance? Where are the limits of my compassion? And I particularly think when we're talking about like the deep levels of corruption in the world, I had to chant a lot about Tony Blair at a certain point. When he invaded Iraq, I had to just sit down because my levels of course, you can go Bush as well, but I think Tony Blair perhaps because there was the performativity of justice and care, within a liberal democracy that took us to war. So like, where were the limits of my understanding of what it means to connect to another human being who is doing everything that is wrong in my eyes, and who I can justify my own loathing of that individual and everything he stood for. And I have to kind of go to those places. Like I can't just rid the world of the stuff that I don't like, and then what? We also throw the baby out with the bathwater of history and all of the amazing things within our beautiful, complex cultures. I suppose it's that tension of how do we honour and celebrate the richness and challenge and have the courage and the bravery to challenge the power dynamics and the rest. And I don't think that is an easy path. And I really relate. It feels easier sometimes to just get rid of what is not working. But I don't know where we are then, because we potentially we get rid of ourselves, right? Because someone else will say about us that my way is not working, and I think you should do this. Like, where does that end, right?
Hello, Samson. I'd love to respond really briefly to that as well as my questions. They're really cheeky.
No.
Okay. I was speaking as someone who I've been weeping through most of this. In a really gorgeous way.
And so speaking with someone who doesn't have a faith tradition that has ever that I've ever landed with it, and who's someone, and so I resonate with this sense of beingness. That's the thing. That's a lot of what you said, Samson, about the finding God in everything. But part of me, so earlier you spoke of organising, how we need to dismantle systems, and also we need structures. And a part of me that longs to have the structure of a faith tradition, the holding of a faith tradition. I fucking love to have that. Be able to just surrender into that. So yeah, it's like a bit both.
The word humility is really what I come back to.
Yeah. Thank you.
So my question was something else. It was you spoke about spiritual bypassing, and I realise I'm always really interested in can you be truly liberated if you're busy bypassing the reality of your interdependence with everything? I just can't get how you can feel liberation. So I just love to hear.
Can I take that?
Question I couldn't hear.
Yeah.
There's something about if part of me just hasn't got a clue how you can feel liberated when you are spiritually bypassing. How can you feel your true radical interdependence and the liberation of being one with everything when you're bypassing realities of suffering elsewhere? I'm dumbfounded, so I'd be curious to hear.
I'm going to grab that and just place it here and see if we can get that in. Because first of all, we have 5 minutes and we want to really respect time. So if you need to leave at 1, please do. At the same time, we are flexible. We are here, and if people feel like they're happy to continue, we are okay as long as the people organising are okay about that. We just need to check because someone might be coming in. We're not going to go beyond 10 past or something, but I just wanted to check in with that. I think spiritual bypass we can come back, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone who wants to speak got a chance. And there were some people at the back. Yes. So the person with the stripy shirt, and then the person with the who was actually the person in the red top was first, I think. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, I'm going to be really dim here. This term spiritual bypassing, you've used it quite a lot.
Yeah.
Have you got a
summary?
A dictionary definition of what
Literally have. Got it. We're on it. Spiritual bypass or spiritual bypassing is a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. The term was introduced in the mid-1980s by John Wellwood, a Buddhist teacher and psychotherapist. Yeah? I suppose that's what I was meaning, and we can all be practicing for years and actually not really healing deep wounds, because it's fucking scary doing that work. It's
So it's like picking the easy stuff, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, or just picking the easy stuff, or being performative about our spiritual practice. I've done this, and I'm getting through. I'm really transforming stuff. I mean, I think there's many ways of spiritual bypass, and you, and then over here,
I think it's linked to spiritual bypassing. I was really moved by Tony's description. His African Caribbean predominant church, and talking about the congregation having certain problems in their lives and then not being able to actually bring those into space.
Totally.
And I think we do that a lot, don't we? When we it's hard to imagine. Well, it's hard for me to imagine Jesus or Buddha sort of sitting there and going it's really hard to pay rent. It's really hard to kind of raise my family. It's like somehow our spiritual heroes have become somehow we've added a lot onto them, which makes them somehow unlike us, and then we try and become like them somehow, often unconsciously. But in order to do that, we have to kind of bypass most of the things that are actually in our lives and have value to us. And I often think, when I'm trying to speak to people in positions of power or be a person in a position of power myself, it's quite hard to focus on our commonality and our sort of problems and issues. Like, yeah, often people, you get into this dynamic where somehow you've got to say something inspiring or, you know, above or like better or...
I'm on it, yeah.
Yeah, so I really like that you just said, oh, the work starts with me, like all of that. Because then that, with that self-awareness, you... Like I was thinking about Tony's church, somehow it's so vivid and it moved me to tears. That just that description of maybe like a pastor or a priest, just sort of like almost like so inspiring but slightly intoxicated with what it's like to go beyond the everyday problems. But then that means that there's something very sweet about that, isn't it? It's like it's a bit sickly sweet. Like we all want to hear people who inspire us and lift us out of our suffering, but actually the work isn't really there. You know, it's like to face what we're all dealing with, and yeah, it's really, really hard work, but it's given me like a lot of inspiration just to hear you and know that other people are doing that. It's
yeah, which is what I think also comes back to spiritual community. Like I don't think I can face a lot of the things that I've had to maybe face over the last 30 years, like, without having spiritual community, because sometimes I've been so in the dark. I couldn't get there without someone metaphorically putting their hand on my shoulder and going, continue, right? Just carry on.
So I can just speak to that as well. And also I think somebody point you made as well. I think there's something about people practicing the faith, and you know, in terms of context of spiritual bypass, not being able to bring things to the surface and deal with them, personally and also within the context of their practice. And never finding peace. So you could be church every Sunday, you know, read whatever your spiritual book is, you know, do whatever practice you need to do. But then, and I've seen this unfortunately, come to the end of their life, and you feel they're in health state. Yeah. But I've also seen people who had a really strong, and I say practice, not always religious, a really strong sense of their religious practice or their philosophical practice, and came to the end of their life and have beautiful end, you know, have beautiful end to their life. So there's something about that surfacing, yeah, that enables people to be not just at the end of their life, to be able to contextualize those different elements of their lives again, and that could be very challenging. But that's the work, isn't it? You know, in terms of we talk about practice for daily life. You know, I can't imagine just doing a practice so I can sing a song on Sunday, denigrating people's religion or practice. But you know, there's something about that embodiment of a practice, and using that practice to better understand our own selves, our place in society and community, our commitments. You know, which I think is fundamental to the way we try to do things. And certainly where I try to live, you know, my life. That makes sense.
Tony, I just want to add to that. Like, I think there is a power reading of spiritual bypass, right? Like, we have to bring a reading of power to that. Because actually, if we have a trauma-informed reading of spiritual practice, it is, you know, to surface trauma in our lives is so deeply painful. And that's differentiated according to the multiple intersecting kinds of, you know, violence that people have, you know, experienced presently and historically. And I also want to just add that sometimes spiritual bypass is a way of surviving, right? We may not be able to deal with everything that we can all the time, so bringing that reading is really critical. I just want to, unless you had did you have a point about, maybe but I just want to make sure, because you have been waiting, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, also as I've been waiting and listening, something more clear comes to me about the term spiritual bypass, you know, in the context of being in a conversation about colonialism and faith. And I think for me, like starting yesterday, I've been particularly thinking about the fact that I'm from two faiths, Christianity and Buddhism. My father, Christian from Hanwell, West London, and my mother from Penang, Malaysia, Buddhist. That within our household there's the sense that these two religions at their core are the same. That there's a sort of limited amount of difference that there can be in the route to true happiness for individuals and humans as a collective. And that, you know, Jesus is saying to a traumatized people, as I read it, it is really, really hard, but love anyway. Be generous anyway. Stop criticizing the one oppressing you or that you think is wrong. Forgive them, and then forgive yourself, or forgive yourself and then forgive them. And keep loving anyway, because no matter what happens to you by the hands of another human, it's worse to stop loving. And to me, that's the exact same thing. It's indistinguishable from compassion. The idea of compassion. So what comes to me now is the entire framing of colonialism. It's almost like colonialism is a synonym for a spiritual bypass, or as a collective entity of spiritual bypass. Because when we go back to the religions, the religion, the teaching of the religion that the colonialism is apparently based on, the result of that teaching is not at all evident in the behaviour of the colonial way or the capitalist way. So yeah, that was just what came to me now from your information.
Yeah. And I think we have to understand Jesus fundamentally as a colonised person. I think we miss that because he gets taken off by empire and made into this greater thing within empire, but his context is colonial and is to do with the land and what was going on with the land and people struggling. And so when Jesus talks about loving your enemies, he's very clear we have enemies. It's like, this is the context. We have an empire. Like, this is who we mean. Like, it's not just like, oh, you know, people you're not getting along with. That's the context. And it's a kind of love-based response to that, and a particular spiritual love-based response to that. But that is the context in which the response is happening.
Yeah, go for it. Yes.
So I want to preface this, well, actually just acknowledge on behalf of all of us that there's a cultural predominance here of the Abrahamic religions, and someone who has an outside insight has already spoken. I putting on my outsider hat for that, see a richness in the language of power in those religions. We talk about Almighty, we talk about birthrights, we talk about all sorts of things, and I wonder whether framing spirituality from within a discourse on power might be, I'd like to offer that might be a form of colonial thinking in itself, and some of the things that have been said here, you know, axioms presented as truths. Again, you talked about vulnerability, so I feel able to offer axioms described as truths might be denying some people their spirituality.
I'm just like reflecting on that. It's going around in my head. I suppose what that, I think there's absolute validity to what you're saying, completely. But I suppose there's something about the heart and intent. Like, what is my heart and what is my intent? And sometimes I might be using language like that isn't it. I suppose at what point do we go, oh my gosh, I'm nervous about being excluding, or I'm nervous about being using the wrong language, or triggering people, or you know, and I suppose I'm not sure how to get around that with language, because I think the language we are dealing with itself is a product of power dynamics. I don't know how to escape it in a way. Power dynamics are in there. I suppose huge, like the desire to care about when we're doing that, like, and how we're checking ourselves, and how we check ourselves as a practice. I think maybe the sense of, I mean, I suppose all I can say to that is, like, if with that process going on, what I'm interested in is how do we move into that vulnerable space where we can say, oh, that's what's happening actually, this isn't feeling comfortable for me. Can you recalibrate? Or is there another way, like I'm saying, someone's saying this to me, if there's another way you can say this, I'd really appreciate that, or I'd be really interested in that. So because I think our language and our processes of communication are saturated in these systems. I don't know how to escape that. I don't know how to sit outside it, you know. But do you know? Because
I'm confident that you're in that place. That's why I felt comfortable making.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a really important
perhaps
point.
there's a shift that can be made to ask the question from within the framework about thinking, using the language of how we can actually solve actual problems that we want to solve.
Yeah. I mean, the question of what are the different languages, not even available to us, but that we might speak in differently, is a beautiful question. So, yeah, thank you.
That's a great question, isn't it? Because we all live in paradigms. And I'm trying to remember the source of this conversation. African-American female writer.
Oh.
We always read the same books, so I'm going to you for this. I should know this. A name should skip off my tongue, not Adrian Bree Brown. But anyway, so she talks about the presence of misogyny and patriarchy in the civil rights movement, yeah, and the language of the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s. And she spoke about the importance of acknowledging that, but also not letting that remove the allyship that was present in those spaces. So create the dynamics like you've done today to raise that in a way that's sensitive to the support of the movement, but also to recognise that as a way to move forward rather than to divert the conversation or to undermine the conversation. You know, quite often I hate to use this term, but I'm going to use it because it's a contemporary term now, is people talking about things being woke. Quite often that will take the conversation away from the issue, yeah, or being part of a culture war, yeah. What we can do is raise those concerns about the existing paradigms around the language that we're using. But again, going back to the idea of intention, the intention is to learn. So when people bring these things to the table, we don't just say, actually, that's not the framework we're working in, or nobody's raised that before. We don't gaslight, you know, at least not intentionally. So therefore, we can then take that next step. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Tony, I'm hearing bell hooks in your reference.
Bell hooks.
I'm still out of time, right? So we can. We're going to close with I'm going to read something very short to conclude, unless there's a burning. Yeah, go for it. Did you have a burning?
I did have a question, but it's more, I think, maybe just to kind of float out there. Like, I'm really, I guess, interested in just absorbing all that I've heard today, and the questions from in here as well, around how you emphasised how important spiritual community is for you. And I guess I'm kind of I'm interested in what does, drawing from what you're saying, letting everything fall and holding love, compassion at a centre, and letting walls fall and under sun, moon, what a spiritual community could be, is. I think it was that kind of felt, yeah.
It's a really beautiful question, and one that we have, that I have. Also, maybe it's a good point to say that we've done some work around this in our collective, but we want to do a lot more and have these conversations and explore deeper. So, you know, we will be. You know, we have a plan to create something like that. You know, in a particular way, or
particularly in interfaith, cross-faith, whatever we want to call that.
Explicitly, yeah, and like, well, we decided intra-faith for a bit. I don't know, something, because I think a lot of interfaith spaces are Abrahamic centric and very like patriarchal and about tolerance, not about So yeah, we want to be with that question too.
We're just going to close the space. I'm going to just share something to end, which we've touched on here. Breaking with the... comes from a pamphlet for the exhibition we made last year, and this is reference some of it. Breaking with the colonial project requires an undoing of worlds. Undoing worlds in which people are treated as a means. We need to make room for other worlds and ways of being. Art making is a place to do some of this work. It can resist commoditization, it can exist at the margins, it can be accessible, affordable, readable, it can break with other agendas, other imperatives, it can be joyful and can build connection. We want to work with art as a means, not an end. We want to work in ways that place art in the service of justice. We'd argue that spiritual practice can do these things as well, right? I just want to read something from Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and if you don't know her work, she's just an extraordinary healing justice activist and writer, and profound kind of practitioner of ancestry, you know. What is the solidarity, evolutionary sistering, ancestral imperative called for in this moment? What does it look like to be intolerant of colonialism? What life would spring up? What recovery is possible if the colonial force actually shuts down? Close quote. So we are trying to ask ourselves, how do we do the work of shutting the colonial force down? How do we ensure that people matter? How do we build experiences of continuing solidarity? And how do we bring these questions to our spiritual practices and mission? And to quote you over there, how do we keep loving anyway? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, and just maybe one more time we could just show our appreciation to